what if he's bringing energy that doesn't feel respectful? See, the vulnerability of masculinity is you put yourself out there, and if what you put out there isn't received, you feel like a fool. And that's what men are afraid of. They're afraid of feeling like a fool. But the vulnerability of the feminine is you open yourself up to receive something, and it wasn't safe, and now you feel violated. It's not a competition to say which one is more traumatizing, which one is worse, but I think it's helpful to identify those are the stakes. For people watching on the video, just so you know, we're in a lovely kitchen here in London, England, on a Friday, almost noon, in a room full of women who are making the sacrifice not to be getting their homes ready for Shabbos right now. Although, one could argue that by coming here and learning what we're about to learn, that this in itself is a sort of preparation for Shabbos, as I think may become more apparent when we explore the topic. Okay. So being that it is hours before Shabbos, I mean, people watching on the video, I don't know when they're watching. They're probably watching at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. But in real life right now, it is hours before Shabbos. Let's talk a little bit about Shabbos. I know the topic is about masculinity and femininity, but I think Shabbos is a good entry point how to get into that topic, especially because in today's day and age, the subject of gender identity is a heated topic, controversial topic, and there are a lot of questions about traditional roles and how legitimate those are. And so I think a good way to get started on this topic is, I think, let's take the side door. It's a little bit more of a delicate approach, and I just want to talk about Shabbos, okay? And then you'll see how from Shabbos we'll dive into the topic of masculinity and femininity. So Shabbos is an interesting day. How many days a week? 7. It's not a trick question. Not a trick question. It is something of a miracle, by the way, that the entire world observes the 7-day week cycle. Could you imagine if only the Jews kept the 7-day week cycle? Then it wouldn't only be like, you know, when like you have Yom Tov and you have to explain to your employer like, oh no, this year Rosh Hashanah is on these days, and then you have Yom Kippur, and you have to get, imagine if every single week you'd have to tell them when Shabbos is. It's so convenient that wherever you go, Shabbos is the same day. It's always Saturday everywhere, which is actually kind of wild if you think about it. We take it for granted how ubiquitous the biblical week is in the world. And it makes it even more, I think, miraculous that there's actually nothing astronomically or naturally linked to the 7-day cycle. If you talk like a month, for instance, that's a lunar cycle. You can see the moon changing. A year is a solar cycle. You can see the position of the sun changing. But you see the days getting longer and shorter. But the week doesn't correspond to any astronomic changes. It's actually a spiritual concept, a purely spiritual concept. And of course, we know the origin, how that, we'll call it a pattern, how that pattern was implanted in reality was with the first 7-day cycle, which was the 7 days of creation. That basically, there were 6 days of work. God created different things on each of the 6 work days, and that ended with a day of rest. And after the day of rest, it goes back to the beginning, and you have day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6 again, and then Shabbos again, and then lather, rinse, repeat. Okay. So they have that on the shampoo bottles in England, right? Lather, rinse, repeat? Yes, they do. I didn't know if that was culturally specific. I figured it was universal, yeah. Okay. The guy who figured that out, by the way, he doubled all the shampoo sales. Lather, rinse, repeat. Repeat. And they doubled the sales of shampoo with one word. Okay. So you have this 7-day cycle, which originates with creation. And now it exists, it is perpetuated as this ongoing pattern. And those of us who are spiritually sensitive are able to intuit to feel the difference between the 6 work days and the Shabbos. Sometimes you can actually feel that Shabbos is different. It's hard to convey in words to somebody who hasn't kept Shabbos or attempted to keep part of Shabbos. But when you get into it, you can start to feel, you know what I'm talking about, you can actually feel that it's different. There's a story of one of the great holy Hasidic masters, the Ruzhiner, Rabbi Yisrael Ruzhiner. When he was a little boy, he was studying with his malamed, with his tutor, and they were studying the Mishnah that talks about a person who's lost in the wilderness, and he loses count of which day of the week it is, and he doesn't know what day Shabbos is, and what should a person do. The Mishnah discusses various scenarios, and discusses what the law would be in a situation where a guy doesn't know what day of the week it is. He doesn't know when Shabbos is. And the Ruzhiner was a little boy, but a holy little boy, and he said to his teacher, I don't understand the scenario. So the teacher patiently explained it again. Well, there's a guy, he's in the wilderness, there's nobody to ask, and there are no calendars, and no way to find out the day, and he lost track of the days. And the little boy says again, but I don't understand the scenario. Okay, and he re-explains it. He's in the wilderness, he's lost, he can't ask anyone, there's no one there. He says, but I don't understand the scenario. Now the teacher's getting a little impatient. What don't you understand about the scenario? It's a fairly straightforward scenario. So the little Ruzhiner, as a child, he says, but I don't understand. Why doesn't he just look up in the sky and see if the angels are dancing? Then he'll know it's Shabbos, right? So he was really spiritually sensitive. But at any rate, so Shabbos is a different day than all of the other 6 days. But let's talk about it practically. Shabbos is a day where all work is done. Even if it's not done, it's done. You ever take an exam and you have to it's timed and then they say, pencils down, right? Turn in your tests. But I'm not done. No, you're done. That's it. You're done. Shabbos comes, and whatever it is that we were working on, that we were stressing about, even if we don't feel ready, that's it. It's time to surrender and just to go into Shabbos. So Shabbos is an interesting day where all work is done. And we don't try to accomplish anything. We don't try to do anything. 6 days a week you shall work, and Shabbos you'll rest. And in fact, because Shabbos doesn't do any work, no work is done on Shabbos, or work is not spiritually compatible with the energy of Shabbos. Therefore, if you want to have anything on Shabbos, you have to have gotten it done previously. So if you want to eat on Shabbos, for instance, you have to have gone shopping and cooked and prepared the food on the weekdays. Friday night is not the time to decide to start cooking for Shabbos. Shabbos is the day when we rest. Cooking is one of the 39 forms of labor. It's not spiritually compatible with Shabbos. We don't cook on Shabbos. Cook on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But Shabbos, you receive what was prepared for you during the 6 work days. You don't create anything new on Shabbos. So far, so good? Yeah? Okay. So what's very interesting is, and now I'm going to maneuver into the masculinity, femininity subject. What's very interesting is that the 6 work days and Shabbos have gender qualities ascribed to them. In fact, I misspoke. The way I said it is gender qualities are ascribed to the 6 work days and Shabbos. It's the reverse. The very notion of gender actually originates with Shabbos and the 6 work days, and then from there devolves into what we experience on the human plane as human masculinity and femininity. But the origin is actually the 6 work days and Shabbos. And on an even higher level, which we won't get into, or perhaps we will a little bit later, the 6 emotional energies and the Sphira of Malchus. But maybe we'll come back to them, maybe we won't. The point is that we have 6 work days, we have Shabbos, and they are masculine and feminine. Now, even if you never heard this concept before, I bet you could probably figure out which one is which. which one is masculine, which one is feminine?
The weak is masculine.
The weak is masculine. And therefore,
Shabbos is feminine.
Shabbos is feminine. And that's why Shabbos is a Shabbos queen. Shabbos is feminine. Okay, so what does it mean that the 6 work days are masculine and Shabbos, the day of rest, is feminine? Why are they masculine and feminine? If we can understand this, then we can understand what masculinity and femininity really are. Because, a lot of times we have certain ideas about masculinity and femininity that may or may not really be existentially true. And we question this legitimately, how much of it is a social construct, right? If you give the boy a doll and you give the girl a truck, won't they just be, can't they just be conditioned to enjoy that the same as if the girl gets the doll and the boy gets the truck? You know what a truck is, right, in America, right? Little toy truck. Yeah. You guys understand my accent and my, yeah, okay. All right. So what does masculine and femininity really mean? Well, one way to look at it is this. The 6 days, the 6 work days are all about doing. You go out and you do, and you accomplish. So in that sense, masculinity is about doing. That's why for a man, one of the most painful questions, but the question that we all ask each other, even though we can't stand being asked it, is you meet a man, you say, what do you do? What do you do? Now who are you? What do you do? Right? And you're sort of defined by your function, what you do. And men are very, very attached to what they do. Like even when a woman will have a career and even be very proud of that career, generally speaking, it doesn't become as deeply embedded in her entire sense of self as with a man. Like in general, and I'm speaking in generalities here, obviously there are exceptions, but like if a man has a job, a woman has a job, and they both lose their job, who's going to be more devastated? Who's going to question more, well, what am I without what I do? It's more of a man's problem to identify so thoroughly with what you do that you're like, if you're not doing it, you're questioning who you even are.
I think the same applies to women these days.
What?
I think the same applies to women today.
It can apply to women today. I said these are generalities, but yes. And by the way, you might argue that that is the masculinization of women that's occurred in today's day and age. But in general, yes, like I said, definitely a woman can have a career and even be very, very proud of her accomplishments. But it's much more of a man thing to say, if I get fired, I will literally kill myself. That's a man's issue. Not saying a woman never had that response, but that's like not only something that can happen to men, that happens to men every day. So there's clearly something different. And I know in our day and age, we hate to speak about any type of these gender qualities as having any real substance. And we like to believe that it's all completely social constructs. But to a certain degree, there are certain existential truths which are just unavoidable. And that's what I want to try to pinpoint, what aspects of masculinity and femininity are just simply unavoidable. They're like written into the fabric of the universe, and we can't fight them. So one thing is that men are about doing and identifying with what I do and going out there and making my mark and accomplishing something, and also keeping busy. Men need to keep busy. There's nothing more nerve-wracking than being around a man who has nothing to do. Now, that's the 6 work days. Shabbos is about not doing. But that doesn't really do it justice, because then it's like the doing and the lack thereof. That doesn't really, what's Shabbos? What's femininity? It's just not doing. It's not masculinity. That doesn't really adequately explain it. So another way of saying it is actually, instead of saying 6 work days and masculinity is doing and Shabbos and femininity is not doing, another way to say it, which is actually more accurate, is 6 work days and masculinity is doing. Shabbos and femininity is being. So there's doing and there's being. Shabbos is all about being, because when you have stripped away from you all of the distractions, and by the way, that's what can make Shabbos unbearable for some people, that you can't do all the doing that distracts you from your being ordinarily, and now you just have to show up and be. That can be very painful even. And I was mentioning about the masculinization of women. I think part of our high-tech society where everybody's always plugged in and being bombarded with demands for their time, doing, and being highly distracted, I would say that toxic trait of our culture today is actually a masculine quality that need to constantly be distracted by doing something. Whereas Shabbos, the feminine day, is like, I don't have to be doing anything. I can just be existing, and existing itself has value. Just showing up, just having an experience. And there doesn't have to be anything productive in the conventional sense of, here's a job, go get busy, get it done. Shabbos is more like, no, today we're productive by not being productive. Today we're productive by remembering that there's something deeper and more essential than just all the stuff that we run around doing all week long. That's why, by the way, Jewish identity is generally attributed to your mother, and your tribal affiliation is attributed to your father. You know that in Jewish tradition? So, for instance, a Kohen, a Levi, a Yisrael, these are tribal affiliations. And that goes through the father. You know about the guy who went to the rabbi and he said, Rabbi, I really, really want to become a Kohen. And I would like you to arrange that for me. And I'm prepared to make a generous donation to the shul. Rabbi says, I can't do that for you. He says, no, Rabbi, I really want to become a Kohen, and if you could arrange it for me, I'm going to make a very generous donation to the shul. Rabbi says, I can't do that for you. He says, no, Rabbi, it's going to be a really generous donation to the shul. Rabbi says, listen, can you explain to me, why do you have this obsession? Why do you want to become a Kohen? Why is it so important to you? He says, well, I got to tell you, Rabbi, why it's so important to me. Because my father was a Kohen, and his father was a Kohen. His father was a Kohen. So it's extremely important to me that I should be a Kohen. Right. The joke is, obviously, that if his father was a Kohen, so he's a Kohen. So tribal affiliation in Jewish tradition goes through your father, because your tribal affiliation is your function within society. It's what you do. So from your father, you get what you do. But being a Jew, that's your essence. That's who you are. So you get that from your mother. So you get your doing from your father and your being from your mother. And you might even say it's your father who teaches you how to do, and it's your mother who teaches you how to be. Your father teaches you how to go out into the world and do something. But your mother teaches you how to be something in the ideal situation. So we have these two paradigms. We have 6 work days, and we have Shabbos, which is masculine and feminine, which is doing and being. Now, I alluded to it earlier, that there's another aspect to this relationship. And I said that Shabbos only has what was prepared for it on the 6 work days. Right? So let's talk a little bit about that relationship. Shabbos only has what was prepared for it on the 6 work days. If one misunderstands this concept, one misunderstands femininity, and can come to very wrong conclusions about femininity. One can make a mistake that femininity is actually inferior to masculinity, in as much as that femininity is passive and masculinity is active. Now, I want to make sure you're understanding and following me. I'm telling you the mistake that people make, not the truth. But it's a widespread mistake. The mistake is masculinity is active, femininity is passive, and therefore masculinity is primary, femininity is secondary. Or as somebody introduced herself to me when I came in, I won't say names, I'm so-and-so's wife. And then she said, no, I'm not. And she said her own name. You're right. That's right. You're not so-and-so's wife. You are who you are. You have your own identity, your own name. But that's a mistake a lot of times, right, that we make, that a woman is almost like an accessory to a man, right? So where does that mistake come from? Because there's a basis to the mistake, and I think we need to acknowledge where the basis to the mistake comes from so we can correct it. The basis to the mistake is, as we mentioned, the 6 work days really do provide for Shabbos. And in that sense, Shabbos is dependent upon the 6 work days. And there is a relationship of giver and recipient. It really is there, and it's unavoidable. We can't ignore it. And as I was saying before, as much as we would like to say that there are really no existential differences between masculine and feminine, it's all a social construct, there's certain realities. For instance, to me, the clearest illustration of this is the biological example, because it's irrefutable, it's undeniable, it's empirical, that women are the ones who get pregnant and have babies. And yet, they can't impregnate themselves, at least not yet. And I don't believe science will ever be able to accomplish that because of the way that masculinity differs from femininity. So femininity, in a certain way, is sitting around waiting for that which she receives from masculinity. So if you didn't cook a meal for Shabbos on the 6 work days, and now it's Shabbos, you can no longer cook the meal because the spiritual energy of Shabbos is incompatible with cooking a meal or doing any other work. She only has what she received. She needs to be impregnated, so to speak. And if you only hear that half of the story, it's like, wow, she's really passive. She's just sitting around waiting to receive. But you have to tell the other half of the story. And this, I think, is the crucial omission, and this is the root of the error. The other half of the story is, yes, after femininity receives from masculinity, she takes what she received and she upgrades it. And the upgrade that she gives is incomparable to what she received. It's not twice as good as what she got, not even 1,000,000 times as good as what she got. It's infinitely greater than what she got. It's an incomparable upgrade. What do I mean by that? So yes, the biological example. A woman cannot impregnate herself. And yet, after she receives what she receives from her husband, this packet of DNA, okay, she turns that into your baby. I mean, that's an incomparable upgrade. You're starting off with, a little bit of genetic code, and 9 months later, you have this person with a personality and a smile and a name. So that's a prime example of how femininity receives, but after she receives, what she does with what she receives is so much greater than what she received in the first place. 6 days of work and Shabbos, the same thing. So 6 days of work, yeah, you have to bake the kugel on the 6 days of work, or you don't have a kugel on Shabbos. But then you take that kugel and you give it to Shabbos, meaning you eat that kugel on Shabbos and use it to celebrate Shabbos, and then that kugel becomes much more than just a bunch of calories. That kugel becomes meaning. It becomes purpose. In other words, the kugel that you eat on Shabbos that was baked during the 6 days of work imbues you with the purpose and the meaning to go back out for another 6 days after that and do it all over again. So what has greater value? A piece of kugel or purpose and meaning. So the 6 days of work provide the kugel, and if Shabbos doesn't get the kugel from the 6 days of work, she doesn't have the kugel, and yet she takes that kugel and she turns it into purpose and meaning, which is an infinite upgrade. So if you want to understand masculine and feminine, basically you have to understand this relationship. That half of the sentence is she's passive, she's waiting, she's the recipient. Yeah, that's the half of the story, half of the sentence. But the other half of it is, and after she gets what she gets, she turns it into something incomparably greater than what he gave her in the first place. That is true, by the way, on every level, in every masculine and feminine paradigm. Now, you asked me before we started, will we speak about this internally in the microcosm within an individual? Because as you were correctly implying, there's masculine and feminine within each individual as well. All of these things are fractals, like in mathematics, fractals. They're patterns which repeat on different levels. So just like we see these patterns of masculine and feminine in time with the 6 days and Shabbos, and we see it in biology with male and female, we even see it within ourselves and on various levels. For instance, I'll give you an example. Within a person, emotion and speech are masculine and feminine. You want to guess which one is which? So think about it in these terms. Remember, masculine is the initiator that provides the raw materials. Feminine is the recipient who takes that. But once she takes it, she amplifies it and makes it far greater than what she received in the first place. So speech is feminine. Why? Because let's say you're talking about a feeling. Now, you can't talk about the feeling if you haven't got the feeling in the first place. So in that sense, the feeling is masculine. It's providing what to talk about. But then once you start talking about it, what happens is the feeling becomes far more poignant. You ever had that experience where you start to talk about something painful and then you choke up? You say, I have to stop talking or I'm going to get emotional. Hold on a second. That makes no sense. If the feeling is already that powerful that it's going to make you cry, why would it be worse if you continue talking about it? If the feeling is there already, then you should cry even if you stop talking about it. And yet, we all know that if you stop talking about it, the feeling will go away. And if you continue talking about it, the feeling will become amplified. Why? Because it's this funny thing. On one hand, speech is just a vessel. It's just, this cup. If you don't put water in the cup, then the cup is empty. But femininity isn't a cup. A womb isn't a receptacle. It's not a place where you deposit this genetic information and you take it back out 9 months later. No, it's like the earth. You put a seed in the earth and then it grows the tree. Now, the tree unleashes the infinity within the seed. Like they say, anyone can count the seeds in an apple, but only God can count the apples in a seed. There are infinite generations of apples within the apple seed, but that's only unleashed by putting it in the earth. So the earth is waiting for the seed. That's femininity. She's a recipient, but she's not a receptacle. A receptacle means you put something in and then you take the exact same thing back out. The earth, you don't put the seed in and come back later in the fall and harvest the seed. No, you harvest the apples that were grown from the seed. And those apples have seeds which grow more apples. So the point is that when femininity receives something, she unleashes the infinite potential that was latent within what she received. So getting back to emotions and speech. I might have an emotion, but until I start speaking about it, I won't really feel it. And if I stop speaking about it, it can fizzle away. Same thing, by the way, with intellect. If you don't have an idea to speak about, so you have nothing to say. The speech needs to receive the idea in order to have... Speech is like the recipient, and it receives the idea, and then it channels the idea, and you speak about the idea. But it's not just a channel like, just a conduit where the information just goes through it like a fiber optic cable. That's not what speech is. When you have an idea, let's say, and you talk it out, or like you're a teacher and you give classes like I do all the time, you will never understand any subject as clearly as you do after you've taught it. Why? If I understand it well enough to teach it, then this is as well as I can understand it. No, there's something that happens when you speak it, when you channel the idea through speech, all of a sudden you understand it better. Why should I understand it better? I'm saying what I already knew. I came in here and I'm telling you what I knew already. And yet by saying it to you, somehow I know it so much better now for having channeled it. That's what femininity does. It doesn't originate the raw materials, it receives the raw materials, but when it processes the raw materials, it always brings out something infinitely greater. And again, every masculine feminine paradigm will always have this property. I'll give you another example. Teacher and student. Teacher and student is a great example. So teacher is masculine, student is feminine. Now, if you only look at half of that, the student is inferior to the teacher. Well, hold on a second. You know what our sages say? They say, I've learned much from my teachers, even more from my colleagues, but from my students most of all. How can I learn from my students? If they're the students, I taught them. They learned from me. Any mother knows this. Who do you learn the most from? Your teachers. I mean, your children. Your children are your teachers. Your children, you teach your children? No, your children teach you. Now, they teach you through your teaching them. But you never understand a life lesson as poignantly as you do until you've taught it to your child. So teacher-student is another example where the teacher is the giver, right? The teacher comes in and provides the lesson. But something happens, and when I say a student, I mean a real student. I mean someone who's really attached and who's receiving. When a real student receives the teacher's lesson, the teacher ends up gaining way more than even the student gained from the teacher. Same thing, by the way, with tzedakah, with charity. Our sages say, more than the donor does for the recipient does for the donor. And it's not just a feel-good slogan. It's literally true. Because the donor, whatever he gives, however much money he gives, even if it's a great amount, he gives this to this guy, and the guy goes and he buys groceries for his family. Okay, extremely important. But what does the donor get back through his giving? He gets a mitzvah, which is incomparably greater than whatever amount of money that he gave. So every time you have masculine and feminine, you have this paradigm. Yeah, sure.
I see you speaking to a room of women and putting a positive spin on the essence of femininity.
Okay, I wouldn't call it spin. I think I'm being,
Okay.
I think it's being, this is sincere. I'm not trying to gloss it over.
I don't want to, but what about when you speak about putting in something good and getting out something better? What about when something not so good is
We'll get to, don't worry. Yes, we will. I just want to make sure everyone understands the paradigm first, and then we'll troubleshoot it. Okay. So, and we'll get to this. I'll just repeat the question, which is, you're talking about masculine and feminine relationship as a provider and a recipient, but a true recipient, one who ends up processing what she received and giving it back much more powerfully. And you're saying, well, what if what he's providing is unwanted, negative instead of positive? Okay, great question. Well, I'll get back to that hopefully soon, because it is Erev Shabbos, so I am aware of, ultimately, there are time constraints. Okay. I just want to make sure, let me refocus and check back in with everybody. So we understand this concept that masculine and feminine, in their spiritual archetypes, are a provider and a recipient, but not a recipient in the sense of she only gets what she gets and that's all she ever has. A true recipient in the sense that she turns around and becomes a provider as well, and actually ends up becoming a greater provider than him. Now, can I share with you something? Are you okay with a moment of empathy toward men? Can we do that? Okay. Well, okay, you'll consider maybe. So I want to just share with you one of the hardest things about being a man. So you're already laughing, you don't want to even be empathetic to it. Okay, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe my vulnerability here is misplaced on the behalf of men. I'm going to put it out there because I think it'll create greater shalom bayis, greater peace in your home, if you'll understand this pain point that almost all men experience to some degree. It's just something to be aware of. I told you before, masculinity is about doing. Another way of saying that is providing, being the initiator, the giver. That's what masculinity is. But then I told you femininity is not a truly passive recipient. She takes that, turns around, amplifies it, infinitely upgrades it, and gives it back. So I'm not asking you for pity. I just want you to consider this. Do you understand then how strange it is to be a man when intuitively you're aware that your entire function is to be a provider, to be a giver, specifically a giver to your feminine counterpart, which is your wife, and that your whole identity is about being a giver, and at the end of the whole process, who's the bigger giver? She's a bigger giver than you. And you'll never be the kind of giver that she is. So I don't know if you realize this, but for men, and very few men can articulate this, but in my experience, when I've articulated this for men, they're like, yeah, that's true. She's always going to be the bigger giver. Like, I'm going to give you an example that the Talmud uses, and if you are reductionist about it, you might think it's mundane or trivial, but if you understand it on a spiritual level, I think it's profound. The Talmud says, who's a bigger giver of tzedakah, of charity? The woman or the man? And of course, it's talking about traditional gender roles, but the point is the metaphor here. It says that a pauper comes to the door and he asks for something to eat. The man went out and he worked to buy flour and he brought home the flour. Can the pauper, the beggar at the door, eat flour? No. He eats the bread that the wife baked from the dough that she needed from the flour that the husband brought home. Now, I understand, don't get caught up on the particulars of this because it's a metaphor, because I understand today women go out and they work and they buy the flour as well. But what we're describing here is something existential about masculinity and femininity, that there's something about masculinity. He's the one who, so to speak, brings home the flour. He brings home the raw materials. But the raw materials themselves are not useful. Raw materials are raw materials. The woman is the one who takes raw materials and makes them useful. She puts them into a form that actually benefits people. Like I was saying before, she can't impregnate herself, but in the end, once she's impregnated, she's the one who delivers that baby, which is an incomparable upgrade. So she's always the one who ends up delivering, no pun intended, I guess, with the birth metaphor, but she's the one who ends up delivering that which is actually of value. So he's the one, he's getting upstaged. Because whatever he provides her, she takes it, she upgrades it, and gives it back to him in a far superior fashion to how she received it. So you understand, again, I'm not trying to get your pity, but you understand why that might be a source of insecurity for men. Do you understand why it might be a source of insecurity for them? Okay.
Can I just add
Yes.
something? I want to props to Varalea. We were filming, we recorded a podcast, and we were just at Spachet, we were just doing one on marriage and masculine, feminine, and she gave a wonderful concept, and I did it. I just want to add to the insecurities or the upset about how men feel. I might not be doing it justice, but she was describing Adam and Eve and how men come essentially from the ground, from nothingness, whereas women come from something. They come from the side of Adam, and it can sometimes be this like insecurity of being felt like, they don't want that to be something that's shown, or that's like something that they fear to feel, whereas that kind of plays into it a little bit. Yes,
there's a certain essential insecurity. In this particular instance, what I want you to understand is that which defines a man is actually something that women do better than men. So I just want you to process that. That which defines a man, not something that's incidental to masculinity. The very definition of masculinity is their ability to provide and to give. Women actually do that thing better than men.
Do you think that every man defines himself by that? Do you think that every man defines himself by that role?
I think that men are defined by that role on an existential level, and we are either in tune with it or less in tune with it, but the truth is there whether or not we're aligned with it on a conscious level. So, in today's day and age, we're very much conditioned by certain messages about everything, really. So we may be further away from these truths, but that's why we have the teachings of the Torah to come in here and sort of just say, hey, these are the truths, and reality check. Sometimes it's helpful to get back to the things that are inescapable. And the reason why I talk about stuff like this really is because if we don't know what's inescapably true, we end up having a lot of heartache, because when you're living in conflict with reality, even if you don't know that's the reality, it causes frustration. Okay, so that's the reason why we're speaking about these ideas. But do you understand now what I was saying before, that there's a certain inherent insecurity that a man has, that he's a provider and yet she's always going to be a greater provider, because what she receives from him, she upgrades it and gives it back to him? Okay, you understand this? Okay, so without going into great length about a male role, I'll just tell you one quick thing. When I speak to men, and I'm not going to tell you everything I speak to men, because it's actually not so healthy for everybody to know everybody else's spiritual role, because then we keep tabs on each other and it can feel like we're being judged. So I won't tell the men everything I told you, and I'm not going to tell you everything that I tell men. But one of the things that is very helpful to a man to understand is that, yes, it's true. You, men, whatever you give your wife, she's going to turn around, upgrade it, and give it back in infinitely upgraded fashion. But what makes you indispensable, I'm saying you, men, what makes men indispensable is that in a proper masculine-feminine paradigm, the man is the one who gives first. So I always tell men, she's always going to upstage you if you're comparing who really gives more. But where you shine, men, where men shine, is in being the initiator. And what do I mean by being the initiator? The biggest tip that I give to husbands is, when you walk through the door, when you come home from work, and even if she was also out at work, doesn't matter, these things are inescapable. You walk through the door, and you feel beaten down by life. I'm speaking to men. A man feels beaten down by life, and he walks through the door, and he attempts to take emotional comfort from his wife. As much as she will try to provide it, it will not work. It will not work. Because that is not how masculine and femininity interact. I tell men, if you want emotional currency, if you want to receive emotional energy from your wife, the only way to properly get it in a way that is respectful to both of your inherent roles is that you, the male, invest in her first. And what that means, very, very simple terms, I tell men, even if you come home and you're beaten down by life, walk over to her and make a deposit, an emotional deposit. And the beauty of it is she takes everything you put into her and she infinitely upgrades it. So you don't have to give her a lot. You can give her 30 seconds of sustained eye contact and genuine interest where the phone is off. And if you just give her that deposit, you give her that emotional energy, she gets filled up with that. Like, she becomes pregnant with that. And then she'll turn around, she'll give birth to infinitely more emotional energy, which will sustain the relationship and which will give you, the man, that emotional connection that you want. But the mistake that a lot of men make is they approach their wives as takers, and then everybody's frustrated and disappointed and heartbroken. But if a man can be the initiator, which means you make the first emotional overture, and even if it's tiny, it's okay. She'll take it and upgrade it and then put it back into the relationship, and then everyone will be happy. And that's what works. So, and you're okay if I tell men that when they come home, they should be the one to make the emotional deposit? You're okay with me telling men that they shouldn't walk through the door? Yeah, I'll get applause for that.
The minimum possible investment.
What? The minimum possible investment. I can leave out that part, yeah. Yeah. But you know why I tell them that the minimum, in all seriousness, the reason why I tell them the minimum possible investment is because, and again, I'm not asking you for pity, but men are so daunted, they're so intimidated by the level, what they perceive to be the level of emotional investment that's necessary in the relationship, that they don't even try anymore. And sometimes they just need to be told, hey, just walk through the door and walk to her first, give her eye contact, say hello, and pay attention to her for 1 minute, and you'll be amazed by what comes back to you. As opposed to walk through the door and immediately turn her into your mother and become, this is the complaint that women have. That, oh, he's just another one of the kids. I have kids who cry and they need me, and now this big kid comes home and he needs me. And the reason that that's a complaint is because when in a masculine and feminine paradigm where you have a husband and a wife, a husband can only receive from his wife what he's receiving back from her from the upgraded form of his initial investment. Okay, but that's enough about men. Now, let's talk about women. So how do you play the woman's role in this relationship? What is the woman's role? So you might say, well, nothing. I'm just sitting around waiting. I'm waiting. Which, by the way, there's some truth to that, and I think we should talk about that. The frustration of being a woman in a relationship with a man is the frustration of, I'm sitting around, I'm waiting. I'm waiting. When's something going to happen? Nothing's happening. And I told you, men have a struggle with feeling insecure. Women have a perennial issue with feeling ignored and neglected. Because I'm sitting here waiting for him to make a move, to bring some energy to the home, to the relationship. He's not bringing the energy, so what am I supposed to do? I'm just sitting here. It's like, it's Shabbos already, and nobody baked a kugel during the 6 work days, and now we have no kugel. And what will happen very often is that a woman will step up, and women are capable, of course they're capable of doing it, and they'll step up and say, you know what, you won't do it, I'll do it. And that will work in certain contexts of life, like something that you as an individual can do as an individual. So, all right, you're not a weakling, you're not a wimp. If there's something your husband's not doing, okay, you can go and do it yourself. But I'm talking about stuff in the relationship. If the husband's not initiating, and then what, you go and you become the initiator, does that ever work? Does that ever work? It fights against the fabric of the masculine and feminine paradigm. And that's why it doesn't work. So then, how do you do this? It's a very tricky role here, the feminine role. What are you supposed to do? You're meant to just wait around? I mean, that can't be the answer. Just wait. Just wait. You'll be waiting forever. You can't just wait around. But you identify with this frustration of just kind of like, when's something going to happen? All right, forget it, I'll do it myself. I think that's a common experience that women have. Okay. So first of all, I want to share with you a life hack for those who are in the feminine role. And this could be any feminine role, like being a wife to a husband, or like we said, teacher-student. A student is a feminine role, or any true recipient is a feminine role. Or even internally, like we said, the emotions and speech is masculine and feminine. Here's a life hack, what the feminine side of the equation can do so that she's not just waiting around bored. You have to have a keen eye. You have to notice details, microscopic details, which, by the way, good news, masculine and feminine, Masculine is more generalities, big picture. Feminine is more detailed oriented. Which is why, like, for instance, the husband will say, let's take the kids to the zoo tomorrow. Great idea. That's big picture. Did he figure out, are we packing sandwiches? Is there a car seat in the car for the baby? What time are we getting there? I mean, all of the actual nitty-gritty details, that's more feminine thinking. So the good news is feminine thinking is more detailed oriented. So you have to have a keen eye, an eye for the detail, and here's what you have to do. You have to identify the most microscopic form of giving. When a man gives even a tiny amount, you have to identify that and receive it. And I'll tell you why. First of all, whether you believe me or not, I'm going to tell you a fact, that many men dry up. I'm not faulting women for this, but it's just a fact that many men will say, well, I put myself out there, it wasn't received. Why should I make a fool of myself? So they stop offering, they stop initiating. And when that, by the way, when that happens, when a man shuts down, he's no longer putting the energy into the relationship, that can become a real, like, in some cases, it's almost impossible to come back from it because you need him to initiate. He's the initial provider. That's what masculinity is. So the life hack is, if you're the feminine component here in this relationship, is to have a really keen eye, a detail-oriented eye, to be able to identify even the most microscopic form of giving. And I'll tell you why. Because when femininity receives from masculinity, masculinity will then create more. I'll give you an example of it, which is counterintuitive, because what I'm going to say is nursing. A nursing mother is actually masculine, because in that case, the baby is feminine. The nursing mother is masculine because that's the recipient, the provider. And of course, the baby is truly feminine because it's receiving the milk and turning it into its body, which is an infinite upgrade. It's always an infinite upgrade. But as long as the baby nurses, the mother will have milk. The baby doesn't nurse, if the baby doesn't nurse, the mother doesn't make milk. Okay? So that's provider-recipient. As long as the recipient is receiving, the provider will have what to provide. The recipient stops receiving, the provider shuts down and stops providing. So when that happens, and you're in that frustrating situation where it's like he's not doing anything, he's not bringing anything to the table, identify even something microscopic, something trivial that he is providing, and receive it deeply. What will happen is it will trigger within him the flow, and he's going to start to make more. And it becomes a virtuous circle where he makes more and he makes more and he makes more. The problem is often that women are waiting for something more significant. They're waiting for the man to make a move, which is more of a grand gesture. And then, but he's not ready to be vulnerable that way and put himself out there to make a grand gesture. And so we're at the stalemate. So the way to break that awful vicious cycle and to initiate a virtuous circle is catch him doing something, even the tiniest thing, where he's being a provider. So for instance, I'll give you an example, something silly and trivial. If he comes over to you and he says, I heard something interesting. I heard about the election or whatever. And you're preparing for Shabbos, and he's talking about the election, and you're like, oh, this is so boring. I'm not even interested in this, right? Like, tell me later, right? And I get that. I totally get that. But what I'm saying is, it might be strategically advantageous if you, as a woman, were to identify the fact he's bringing something. Now, I get it. What he's bringing right now, this is what I was waiting for. This is not what I had in mind when I was saying make a move, do something. But take anything even the littlest thing, and you start pulling, and something amazing happens. He starts creating more, and the flow opens, and you'll see a man blossom. When a woman receives deeply, and when I say receiving deeply, I mean that you really make yourself vulnerable to say, whatever it is that he wants to give me right now, I'm accepting this as his deepest gift. And when he feels that his gift is being received deeply, this stream will just open and start gushing. And then, when you've initiated that virtuous circle, then there's momentum in the relationship, and then everybody's happy. She's happy because he's providing. He's bringing emotional energy to the relationship. He's happy because that's all he really wanted to do all along. He wasn't happy shutting down and hiding in his man cave because he's afraid of being vulnerable. He wants to step up and provide for his wife and have her be satiated by what he's bringing. Of course. But what you have to do as the woman is receive even something, a crumb, because a crumb, this is what femininity does. She'll take a speck and she'll turn it into something much bigger. Just like you take that little packet of DNA and turn it into a baby. So you take a speck of the tiniest emotional energy and turn it into currency to carry the relationship. Now, I did not forget, you mentioned before, what if what he's bringing is kind of undesirable?
You made it sound so negative. I was saying, what's the role of the feminine role when...
But let me address what I understood you to be saying earlier. What I understood you to be saying earlier is, what if he's providing and she doesn't want what he's providing? I don't know if that's what you meant, but I want to talk about that. What if he's bringing energy that doesn't feel respectful? Because remember, when you're the recipient, see, the vulnerability of the provider is you put yourself out there, and if what you put out there isn't received, you feel like a fool. And that's what men are afraid of. They're afraid of feeling like a fool. But the vulnerability of the feminine, of the recipient, is you open yourself up to receive something, and it wasn't safe to receive, and now you feel violated. So the vulnerability of masculinity is you end up feeling like a fool. The vulnerability of femininity is you end up feeling violated. And it's not a competition to say which one is more traumatizing, which one is worse. But I think it's helpful to identify those are the stakes. When a man puts himself out there as a provider and it falls flat because his wife doesn't receive it, so he ends up feeling embarrassed. When a woman opens herself up to receive something, and then what she ends up receiving is not honoring and not safe and not respectful, she ends up feeling violated. So, does this resonate, what I'm saying? Does it make sense? Okay. So I'm going to say something that might sound counterintuitive. And there's nuance here, so I hope you'll bear with me to finish the point fully. Part of being a good recipient in true feminine fashion is having boundaries. Now it sounds counterintuitive. Boundaries, that will make me more receptive. Boundaries make me less receptive. It's not true. It's the exact opposite. Boundaries, if I don't want to receive anything from you, then I'm not talking to you. We don't have a relationship. I have boundaries in my relationship with you because I do want to receive from you, and I just need it to be safe. So one of the problems that often happens in a male-female relationship, in a marriage, is where a woman has felt far too many times that what she received was not safe, and she shuts down. I spoke about how men shut down because they put themselves out there and then it fell flat and they feel embarrassed and they sulk off to the man cave. That's when a man shuts down. A woman shuts down when she received and then she felt violated. And then she just checks out. And this happens with women. They'll say, look, I'm not being punitive. I'm not trying to punish him. I've just checked out because it's not safe for me to be emotionally present in this relationship. And that's a tragedy because once that happens, it's also very hard to come back from that. So how do you prevent that from happening, or how do you come back from it if it has happened? Boundaries. Boundaries allow femininity to receive in a more full way without having this subconscious fear that what I'm receiving is going to hurt me. Because if at the back of your mind you're constantly afraid of opening yourself up, then you can never really open yourself up, and you can never really receive. And if you can't receive from him, he feels that he's not being received from. He dries up, he goes off to his corner, and you go off to yours. So one of the skills that femininity requires, much more so than masculinity, is boundaries. You have to know what you're okay with. What feels honoring and what feels safe and what doesn't. And when it comes to setting boundaries, it's very important to understand the difference between a boundary and an ultimatum. An ultimatum is basically telling somebody, you better do this or you better not do this, and here is how I'm going to punish you if you do what I told you not to do, or if you don't do what I told you to do. A boundary is completely different. A boundary is, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. I'm not telling you what to do. I don't control you. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. If such and such happens, I'm not going to be able to be available for that. It's not a punishment. I'm not saying it to get a reaction out of you. I'm just letting you know that I'm not okay for that type of interaction. If that's what's on the table, I'm not going to be available. That's a boundary. When you can set, well, first of all, identify a boundary for yourself, set that boundary, meaning communicate it, and stick to it, the safety that will create in you as a recipient will actually create intimacy. Because then you can relax and receive. But when you haven't set your boundaries, or you're not even aware of your boundaries or what makes you comfortable or uncomfortable, then there's always that thought in the back of your mind, like at any moment this thing could go out of control, and I've opened myself up, and I don't know what direction this is taking me. So boundaries are so important. They don't decrease intimacy, they increase intimacy. If you know what feels respectful and what doesn't feel respectful, and you can communicate that and stick with that and only show up for that which feels respectful, what ends up happening is you'll be much more able to open up and to fully receive. And then when you're fully receiving, what happens to him? He's giving more and more and more and more and more. And then everyone's happy. Okay, so let's just make sure that everybody gets the point. This is a room full of women, so we're just going to focus on the women's role over here. As a woman, you want your husband to show up. You want him to bring something to the relationship. You want him to take some initiative. Put in some thought. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that. In fact, it's futile to pretend that you don't want it. That's what I said before. These things are just existential truths. And if we live in conflict with them, we can't succeed. We can't fight these truths. But if you think that that means that you're meant to sit around and wait, you're only going to breed resentment. You're going to end up being, you're going to be very unhappy. So therefore, are you meant to sit around feeling neglected, feeling bored? No. What we said is 2 life hacks as a feminine party to a male-female relationship. One is catch him doing anything that is even has minuscule positive value. Identify it, receive it, allow yourself to feel filled up with it, even if it's tiny. because by receiving it, he will make more. He will make more. And you'll be happier and he'll be happier. Second life hack is, if you're not safe, you won't receive. You won't feel comfortable receiving. Even if you repeat in your mind over and over again, receive from him, receive from him, receive, you can't fool your inner self. These things are operating on a much deeper level. You can say whatever you want. If you don't feel safe, you will not be able to open yourself up as a recipient. So therefore, figure out what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with. These can be, and by the way, the thing about boundaries is they can be peculiar to you, and they don't have to have rational reasons, because at the end of the day, it's about what makes you feel safe. So if you say to somebody, I'm much more relaxed if I don't have my back to the door. Okay, well, why? That's a weird thing. I don't know. It's just how I'm more comfortable if I'm in a room if my back's not to the door. So you can argue with me that I should feel that way, I shouldn't feel that way. But if that's the way I feel, you're not doing anyone a favor by pretending that you don't have that preference. You're doing yourself and the other party a favor by self-advocating and saying, you know what would make me a lot more relaxed? I picked a silly example like having your back to the door, but probably because that's one of the things that makes me feel weird in the back of my mind is when there's a door in the back of me. But it could be something like, I need there to be no phone in the room when we're having tea. Right? I can't really relax and feel like a recipient if I think there's even a possible, well, the phone's off. Yeah, I know, and it's irrational. But if it's in the room, I just don't feel like I'm really completely able to open up. Okay? And whatever it is, I'm just giving and making up examples. You'll know for you. And if you don't have a problem with him scrolling his phone while he's talking to you, then don't make it a problem. But be an honest self-advocate about what would make you feel more comfortable. And by advocating for yourself, you're going to increase the intimacy in the relationship because you're going to feel more safe to receive. He's going to feel that what he's giving you is being received. And that's the greatest pleasure for a man, is to know what he's giving is being received. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
You gave the example of the husband who comes over to talk about the elections while the mother's cooking, dealing with a few kids.
Yes.
Yeah. So that tiny giving is annoying.
Yes.
So is it okay to say?
Yeah.
Is it okay?
I mean, I chose the example because it is annoying. Right. That was part of the example.
So
Yeah.
you're saying take even the tiny.
Well, I'm saying like this.
Can you say to your
Okay.
husband, I really want to hear this. I would
Okay.
love to talk to you about it.
So
Can you do it later?
it's
After bedtime?
it's a wonderful question. The example of him coming over to you while you're trying to cook for Shabbos, and he wants to talk about the election, and it's just, like you said, it's annoying. Okay. So let's revisit that. I use the term strategic advantage. Okay? You really want to think about this intelligently. So he comes over to you to talk to you about the election, and it's really not a good time. Now, I spoke about boundaries, and boundaries means what makes you feel safe. If you feel unsafe, oh my goodness, that's awful. Can we close the window or something so that we don't hear those gardening, they're using like gas motor gardening tools in the backyard. Okay. So follow me here because this is a nuance that needs to be expressed accurately. If you feel that he's coming over to you to talk to you about the election while you're cooking and that there's something disrespectful about that. What do I mean by disrespectful? Disrespectful like, hey, I want to talk about this thing. I really don't care if it's a good time for you, because this is what I want to talk about now. That's disrespectful. And that's violating. And if you allow yourself to feel violated, you're not doing anyone a favor, because it causes a woman to shut down. So if you feel it's disrespectful, if you feel you're being used, then don't respond to it. And when you set your boundary, do it pleasantly, but firmly. And you can say, I'm cooking right now. I'd love to hear what you have to say, but I'm cooking right now. I'm busy. And that's it. End of discussion. What I'm saying is, if he's coming over to you and you don't feel it's disrespectful of him, you feel that you get why he maybe wants to share this thing, but you don't think it's necessarily the most valuable type of interaction. So it's like, in other words, I'll put it like this. If you were coming to me with something which had much more value in emotional currency, I would probably stop what I'm doing. That's a good way of gauging it for yourself as a woman. If he would come to me all of a sudden and say, honey, we're going on a second honeymoon, pack your bags. Oh, then he would have my attention. But instead he's coming to me and he's saying, I heard an interesting bit of news about the election. It's like, this is what you're coming to me with. Like, I don't have time for this. What I'm saying to you is, you may want to evaluate that based on what is strategically advantageous, the term that I used earlier, and say like this. In truth, I'm not that interested in what he has to say about the election right now. But it's an investment in setting a paradigm which will pay greater dividends. So you may not have time. And if you really don't have time, then set a boundary and say, I'm sorry, I don't have time. But if you could make time, and it doesn't feel disrespectful to make that time, maybe it just feels silly to make that time because it's like, why am I making time for something so trivial? What I'm saying to you is, it's not trivial. If you can take a tiny little speck of DNA and turn that into your baby, you can take a tiny amount of emotional energy and amplify that and turn that into positive vibes in the relationship. So like that good emotional feeling that you want there to be in the relationship, that comes from taking those tiny overtures and receiving them. So just to make sure it's very clear, a woman should never feel obligated to receive anything. Why? First of all, because you're a human being. Why should you feel like you have to do what anyone else tells you to do? But also because, practically speaking, it's the worst thing you can do for your relationship. Because if you feel that you have to receive anything, then you end up receiving nothing. You will shut down. Okay. But if you can make a decision, again, I'll use the term strategically advantageous, and you can say, I'm going to make a decision now to receive something that is a crumb. But if I can receive this crumb, I know how it works now. I understand the underlying mechanics of masculine and feminine. I understand what's going to happen, that by allowing him to open up and receiving what he's giving, he's going to make more. It may be the smart move on your part. And I want to tell you something else that you may not realize that's going on behind the scenes. When he comes to you, and you may not believe this, but when he comes to you with this trivial offering of, I want to tell you about the election, sometimes you don't realize his half of the story. Again, I told you, the man's greatest insecurity of being vulnerable is he'll end up feeling like a fool. It may be the reason he's not opening up to you in that deep way that you think you want him to open up to you is because he feels, whether it's true or it's not true, but this has been his experience subjectively, he may feel that he's done that in the past and it wasn't received. And he's afraid of bringing anything too deep or meaningful. And that's why all you're getting is mundane, trivial stuff about the election. Because that's all he feels safe engaging with. But what should you do in a case like that, where all he's capable of bringing are crumbs, so you can just let that continue to dwindle and dwindle until it's nothing, or you can grab it and you can receive it and amplify on it until it becomes something far more significant. But that's a decision that you're going to want to make, yeah?
This is possibly something you'd speak to them about. But how you said earlier that, you said you don't like sitting with your back to the door. So you've said to somebody, or a woman said to her husband, I don't like sitting with the back to the door. And the first thing they do when they walk into the restaurant, they take the seat with the back to, so that the wife has to sit where she's uncomfortable. The same applies to the phone. You said, I feel uncomfortable at the dinner table with the phone, but the husband will sit there with the phone, having heard back to the door, having heard about the phone. So you communicated, and that hasn't been received. So where do you go there?
Yeah, so where you've communicated a boundary,
Yeah.
and it seems to be ignored. Or maybe even the way you're describing it, not only ignored, maybe even intentionally, like, no, I refuse to comply with this boundary. Okay, so I said it earlier, but I'll say it more clearly. It's not just identifying the boundary, but it's about communicating it and sticking to it. If you've communicated that you're uncomfortable with your back to the door, and he tries to place you in a position with your back to the door, and you've communicated you're not okay with that, then you have to, as graciously as possible, say, I'm not going to be able to do this. I can't do it. I think a lot of times women, especially, are people pleasers. I think that's part of social conditioning. The little girls are taught that you're good by doing what people tell you to do. I mean, boys are taught this too, but much more so girls. And it's so detrimental to intimate relationships, because if you're not comfortable with something and you pretend that you are, eventually something's going to give. You cannot pretend to be comfortable with what you're not comfortable with. And at the end of the day, you're not doing anyone any favor by pretending you are. Something's going to give. So have the courage to know what it is that you require. And hopefully, if you have a partner who's a real partner, you can even articulate some of this and say, I would be able to receive so much more from you if you would do these things that make me feel safe. You know, one of the things, this is like, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But if you give this tip to a married man, 9 times out of 10, it's going to work. And that is, I tell this to married men all the time. And it's so silly, it's so mundane, it's so trivial, it shouldn't have any effect. But I tell them, at the end of the night, you go around, turn off all the lights, lock up all the doors, even if they're locked already, unlock it, lock it, just lock up the house, go to your wife and say, the doors are all locked, it's time to go to bed. There's something magical about that. I don't know what it is. I mean, I do know what it is. But it's when a woman feels safe, then intimacy on all levels. I know when we use the word intimacy, we mean a specific thing, and we use it as euphemism. And I mean that as well, obviously. But I'm saying real bonding can happen on every level. So it's just good advice for a man. And if you have the type of relationship, hopefully, where you can communicate openly, you might even just tell him overtly, like, listen, you're going to be a lot happier making me feel safe than pushing my limits and making me feel uncomfortable. And in most cases, that will work. Now, obviously, if you're in a situation where that doesn't work, where he says, no, I don't care what makes you feel uncomfortable. Okay, so then, then there are bigger issues, unfortunately. But then it's good to at least have clarity about that. Anything else? Sitting here, Erev Shabbos, like we don't have a care in the world. Huh? There's one more thing? Yeah?
What about when a woman, like you're talking about the relationship, I mean, each emphasis about the relationship between male and female. What about when a woman is on their own for whatever reason, you're saying that they're just waiting to give.
Yes.
Well,
But a single woman.
set up,
You talking about a single woman?
or just for some reason, certain areas you need to be both or.
But be more clear about what you're asking.
Well,
So when you're single?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Or
fine.
like, I don't know, if they're not able to do certain parts of, I don't know, giving or,
Uh-huh,
but yes, when you're single or,
yeah.
whatever focusing on it.
So I'll tell you like this. When a woman is single, when she doesn't have that masculine counterpart in her life, she can be pretty successful and fulfilled in life without it. I mean, obviously it's ideal to have it, but she can be okay without it. The reverse is not so true. When a man is single for too long and he doesn't have a woman to receive from him, that becomes a toxic situation. And unfortunately, in today's day and age, where a lot of people are even questioning, a lot of men are even questioning whether they want to be married, whether they even want to have a relationship with a woman. And I could get into that whole other discussion, why these things are being re-examined today. But one of the things to understand is if you understand the feminine masculine paradigm, that the male is the provider and the female is the recipient, and then the one who turns around and gives back what she received. So if a man is a provider and he doesn't have anywhere to give to, that creates a certain pent-up frustration. He has what to give and nowhere to give it. It's like the teacher who has a class all prepared and there's no students to listen to it. And it causes a fair bit of neurosis. But femininity is receptive. And therefore, if she's not receiving from a masculine figure in her life, she may be a little lonely, but it won't cause her real damage. It doesn't cause her to become dysfunctional. So, and it's interesting. Single women just do better at life than single men. And so therefore my answer to you would be, is if you are currently single, then enjoy your life, do what you do. I mean, you are a person apart from whatever relationship you're in. You're not defined as only a wife to a husband. And if you're in a period of life where you are single, so enjoy whatever it is meaningful to you right now at this period of life. And in the right time, when Hashem chooses, then you will be in a situation where you can put into practice all of these things that we've been talking about. Okay? We're good? All right. Thank you. All right.